Hi, today I'm going to talk about designing and making this World of Warcraft Paladin Crest. Hi, welcome to Gray Lightning, my video blog about making things and playing games. And I have a very special person in my family who is a huge fan of World of Warcraft, and the Paladin is his favorite class. And today's his birthday, so we made him this piece of wall art based on the Paladin Crest. Now, this was designed in Adobe Illustrator, cut and engraved on my laser cutter, and the fabulous paint job you see here was done by my son. I had a reference photo for the Paladin Crest, and that's what I used to do the design for the engraving that's on the front. Then I had to create a box for the back, a light box, that would illuminate the cutouts. And there's a piece of frosted acrylic between the puck light and the cutouts so that you can't see inside the box. There's a door here that you can remove the puck light to change the batteries, which of course is important. And I have a remote control. So this is designed to hang on the wall. But what really brings this to life is the amazing three-dimensional paint job that my son did. I engraved the front, so he had those as a guideline, but the painting techniques are really based on his long experience painting miniatures. So he did a great job. So what I'm going to do today in this episode is I'm going to talk to you about how this was designed and how it was made. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop and I'm going to wrap this up because this is a birthday present that's going to be given away later today. This is the reference photo I used in Adobe Illustrator for my design. A lot of the techniques I use here you can find in my video 10 Skills for Designing a Multi-Layer Mandala. You can see from the red and blue lines I followed the design pretty closely except for the crown, which I intentionally lowered down inside the circle. The other references are these green lines. This circle is the size of the puck light I'm going to be using. I've also sketched in the lines of a light box that will illuminate all of the cutouts that I'm going to put in the design. I'm going to do that light box in a different document, but let's just take a look at this front and we'll look at it layer by layer. This is the bottom of 3 layers, and this outline you see here is the outline of the second layer that'll be placed on top of this. All 3 layers have the same set of cutouts that you see in red in the middle. And because this is a very symmetrical design, I mostly drew everything on the left and then reflected it across the center vertical to the other side. The next layer, which is the middle, has a lot of the engraving for the character. All of the red cutout shapes are in the middle. The blue lines are the engraving lines. There's a red line around the whole outside, and that, of course, was copied and pasted onto the bottom layer to guide the placement of that layer. The top layer is a small but important layer. It's the face, and these thick black lines are raster engraving. And the other place I use raster engraving is in the bottom layer. All these runes around the rim are done in the same way, and I'll really zoom in on what's happening there later on in the video. So the most important skills used in drawing this are, first of all, shapes. There's ellipses here. There's 4 of them, concentric circles here done with the ellipse shape. And these little lines, I drew one little line here, and then I used the rotate function, and I copied that line every 10 degrees around the circle. I've mentioned already how important reflect is as a technique in drawing this because the Paladin design is almost completely symmetrical. From the eyes, the little nose in the center is probably the only thing I just drew on its own. Even the crown, I draw half of the crown and reflect it over. The one part that really changes are these little banner pieces down here, and I did reflect it over, but then I modified it afterwards. I hand painted with a brush half of the runes, and then I reflected them all over to the other half. So getting comfortable with reflect is a very important skill. You want to end up with a continuous outside cut line because that's what you're going to copy and paste onto the lower level. And all of the blue and red lines have been done using the pen tool, so very important to learn how to use the pen tool. There's some really good tips for that in the 10 skills video that I mentioned earlier. The straight lines are just point and click, but the curved lines you need to then use the direct selection tool to go in and make some modifications. The top layer is also mostly drawn with the pen tool. Even these mostly oval jowls were drawn with the pen tool. I mentioned that the raster engraving, these thick black lines, are done using the brush tool. You just set the thickness, and then I would have the reference image showing, and I would just draw over it. And once again, everything's mirrored onto the other side. I pulled the 2 green reference items for the box from that first drawing into a brand new drawing. How to design a box like this is a really different set of skills, and I've got a good video on that called How to Design Scale Model Buildings. It's all done in this kind of tab and slot construction, and I try to stay organized by lining it up like this. So these are the sides of the box, and they're in order of how they lay out across the top, and you can see here visually how one piece has to fit into the next piece. The way I know how wide to make any given piece is I go in and I use my rectangle tool and I draw it into where it's going to fit in the top-down view of the box. So there's one side there. Then I use that reference, I pull it up under the piece that it is going to be fitting there, and I use my direct selection tool to grab the ends and make the piece longer or shorter. The way I actually create those tabs is by using my rectangle tool first to create the body of the piece, and then to create all the tabs. So I'll just draw an example here of one tab. When I get all those tabs drawn, I get my selection tool and I select everything that's going to be made into this one piece. And then I use a tool I use a lot, which is Pathfinder. And within that, the Unite function. So when you click on Unite, it'll take all those little pieces and make them into one seamless piece. That's the basic process for things that have outer tabs, but then you have the ones that receive them that have the cutouts. And here's how I do those. To draw the main part of the top and bottom of the box, I drew 3 rectangles, and then I select all 3 of those and do Unite, and that turns it into one more complicated shape. My process now is I lay the piece that's going to be connecting to it next to it so I can see where the tabs are. Then I get my rectangle tool and I draw a little rectangle where that tab is going to fit. And I do that for every one of these indents. Then I use my selection tool to select the body of the piece, plus all the little cutouts, and now I use minus front. And when I do that, it's going to cut away each of those rectangles. Other elements in the back of the box are the cutout for the puck light, which is here, and the hole for hanging the box itself. I use the same outline of this to cut the acrylic for the top of the box. And the last component for the box is a flange that will keep the puck light from falling forward into the box when I put it in place. This flange is going to be glued inside the box back. As I started to think about assembly, I came back and I designed one other thing, and that was this template to help me to place the box on the back of the piece. I can line this up on the outside circle and using all of the internal cutouts, and then I can use a pencil to draw on each of these slots to show me exactly where that box should be glued, because frankly I'm going to be working blind from the back of this when it comes time to assemble it. The last step is to create all the cut sheets organized by material, and the document size is the same as the size of the material. This is a 12-inch by 12-inch piece of wood, my Baltic birch wood. I had 5 wood sheets and 1 for acrylic. Very final step is to import those into Lightburn. I always check for duplicates and eliminate them if they're there. There's none in this case. I make sure the engraving is happening before the cutting on these lines here, and then I set the speed and the power. I also check how much time it's going to take to do each one to make sure that it sounds reasonable. I did that for the back, and I discovered that these runes that I'm going to raster engrave on the outside were being done all at once, and that was causing the head to go back and forth across an 11-inch span. So I double-checked those settings and saw that you had an option to be able to do the shapes individually in it. When I checked that, it actually took 8 minutes off the time to do this one piece. So that's the way I did it at first, but then I had to revert back to doing all the shapes at once, and I'll show you why and what happened. So now all my Lightburn files are ready, and I'm ready to cut. I used my elevated magnetic clamps that I showed in a prior video, and they worked very well for this project. So here I am cutting one of my many wood pieces, and this is most of the parts of the back, though there's a little bit of an overflow on a second sheet. This is the beginning of the top level, and I'm raster engraving some of the lines there on the very top level. Of course, by default, Lightburn always does internal cut shapes before the outer ones. Doing the vector engraving on the middle layer of the design. Here it's doing the cutouts. This video is running at 7 times the actual speed. But it's my OMTech laser is doing a beautiful job. So now we get to the back of the Paladin design, and I'm raster engraving one shape at a time. My first attempt at doing this using the first setting, but you can see what happened. The runes have drifted outside of the space they're supposed to be in, so I had to revert to having all of the raster shapes done at the same time. You get this big movement of the head, but that's actually less disruptive to the placement of the material than doing it the other way. And you can see the result is much better. The runes are all where they're supposed to be in the image. Now the top 3 layers are all cut and they look quite good together. These will be painted individually and then assembled. I have to cut the acrylic top, and now I have all the pieces cut for the box. Assembly is just a lot of careful gluing, and I use these granite samples to hold things in place while they dry. Some of the other parts I've used are these silicone bumpers on all the corners of the back of the box to protect the wall and hold it in place. I got some of these picture frame turn buttons to hold the door, and then there's a hole here at the top where the nail goes to hang it on the wall. This is the puck light. It's held in place with some high-strength adhesive strips. Just drops in here. Then you turn the turn buttons. And here's the acrylic snapped in place on the top. It's not even glued. It's just sitting there. And there's actually warm lights in this puck light, warm and cool, but it's best to have it just on full power. Everything's looking good so far. Now it's ready for painting. Each layer has to be painted just inside the outline that shows where the next layer is going to be. The goal is to interpret the picture, not to try to do an exact copy. My son used the same high-quality acrylics we use for painting miniatures, and you start with a base coat, and then you add on layers of paint and you finish with highlighting. He used techniques like stippling to show the light on the inner circle. It's a technique that lets the base paint show through. He chose to use completely different colors for the 2 books because it makes them look more like books. He used very thin highlight lines and then shadows to make these ribs look very 3-dimensional. He used the same techniques on these 2 diamonds. He gets a much softer 3rd dimension in the face here by creating a gradient. He finished it off by applying a coat of matte varnish with his airbrush. I glued those 3 front layers together, and now I use the template to draw an outline of where the box is supposed to be on the back. I've only applied glue to the wooden tabs, not the acrylic. And I've decided at this point I want to reinforce this with some slats in some places there on the back. So I cut some pieces and glued them basically to the bottom and the sides to reinforce the strength of that connection. I wrapped it up and we had a great little birthday party, and here it is in its final position. You can see in natural lighting it's actually darker than it looks under my studio lights. It looks wonderful here on the game room wall. I have lots of other great projects for gaming and gamers. If you're interested, subscribe to my channel and please turn on notifications.